What is the case for open borders? Join Richard Ebeling and me and special guest John Washington as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that you all know brings you the principled case for the libertarian philosophy. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel, and we're joined by a very special guest, and we're really honored and pleased to have, and that's John Washington. John is the author of one of the most fantastic books I have just finished reading, The Case for Open Borders. Now, y'all know that FFF has stood for open borders well, since our inception. In fact, Richard, you'll recall our great book back in the 90s called The Case for Free Trade and Open Immigration. And with the possible exception of that book, Richard, that you mostly co-edited, but I helped co-edit, this may very well be the best book I've ever read on open borders. And if every American reads this book, I think we're going to see a major paradigm shift. And I would recommend everybody tune in this to go to Amazon or wherever else you buy your books and get it there. Let me just read you some of the editorial reviews that are on Amazon. A powerful and convincing case for human solidarity and cooperation for which John Washington provides a roadmap. The case for open borders offers an accessible and passionate case against border controls. Now, these are different editorial reviews. John Washington provides us with an essential evidence-based, politically sophisticated, and ethically compelling tool to address one of the most important issues of our time. The case for open borders is an urgently needed and timely appeal for justice for the expanding flows of migrants and refugees falling victim inside a hardened and darkening complex of enforced border walls, perilous waterways, and spirals of razor wire. Perhaps the most profound book you'll read this year, and I would second that. John is a staff writer at a community-focused media outlet called Arizona Luminaria. He's written for The Atlantic, The Washington Post, The Nation, The Intercept, and other outlets. John, it is a real pleasure to have you join us. Thank you for doing so.
Thank you so much. That was a very kind and generous introduction. I really appreciate it, and really excited to talk to you both.
Well, we've gone through 80 years, continuous years of this immigration crisis, the death, the suffering, the police state along the border. I experienced this firsthand. I grew up on the border in Laredo, Texas, on a farm on the Rio Grande. I experienced the police state down there. I lived almost half my life on the border, and we have maintained since the very beginning here at FFF that there's only one solution to this. There is no other solution. That all the reform plans are just pure bunk. If they were going to come up with a reform plan that would work, they would have done it by now after 80 years. And we have maintained consistently that open borders is the only solution. So give us a synopsis of your book here, what motivated you to write it, and what you think some of the really important points are in the book.
Yeah, interesting to hear you're from Laredo. I haven't been down in those parts of Texas since this most recent wave of border militarization. But my Lord, I mean, reading the news out of different parts of Texas right now and what Abbott's campaign is to turn it into a little strip of a police state or something is really terrifying. I mean, the most recent news was that he wants to build this new um, pretty large like garrison for the Texas National Guard right along the border in Eagle Pass. Obviously he's lining a river with razor wire and putting actual like buoys with razors in the river. I mean, it's really, really startling. The ecosystems and including the humans who live there are in for incredible and curtailment of their rights. So just interesting to start there. But I guess what's backing out a little bit, what brought me to write this book is being on the border. So I'm here in Tucson, which is not geographically exactly on the border, but it's considered a border town. And I've been reporting on border and immigration policies for a long time. I have, been able to witness pretty close up and close a number of different tries of immigration reform. And one thing that really stands out is how frequently and how miserably any policy fails along the border, or at least fails to do what it's said to do. So I was around and was covering a little bit the 2013 attempt for massive immigration reform. And obviously, I was watching very closely in the last 3 months in the lead up to the release of uh, a recent Senate bill and then a House bill and a couple different tries in between. And just like people keep on trying the same thing and it's clearly not working. And I also noticed that there seemed to be a lack of a positive vision, especially for people on the left. Like I come from the left, I have an activist background. And for a decade, that I've been involved in this work, the only thing that I really hear people say is what not to do. And it's to, minimize the harms that are being acted by the current regime or the current, border and immigration regime. And I didn't really ever hear clearly articulated an idea of what people actually desired. And speaking mostly for the left, I think the right has has their talking points down more. It's just like shut it down, close it down, militarize the border. But then like you talk to folks on the left, like what do you want? You want like a soft version of that? Like okay, why? Like why do you think that's going to work? And I think actually for folks on the left, and I'm not only going to talk about the left here, but I think when they are only able to criticize, especially we saw this during the Trump administration. I mean, people were up in arms. They went out to airports. They, I think very rightfully were alarmed and pushed back hard against things like family separation policy. But to only decry the worst tactics of your political enemies without having a positive vision, I think, is to make an argument on a very slippery slope. It's like, okay, so you don't think that we should be as bad as the Trump administration was, but what do you want? And you only want to limit the freedom of movement for some people. You only want some people who cross the border to be detained and then basically excommunicated. Like, how do you draw the line and where do you draw the line? And I think that it is I desired someone to clearly articulate sort of the opposite extreme, though actually I hesitate to use that word because I don't think it is extreme, the idea of open borders. And I came to that by looking at our history. So you said the past 80 years we've had this, growing this constant ramp up of immigration enforcement and border militarization. That's absolutely true. But before that, we didn't have it. And what was fine. I didn't get a chance to read y'all's book, but I glanced at the first pages and you open with a point that I make repeatedly in the book about we in essence had open borders for some people. I mean, some people were very much restricted, or some people were forced to cross borders and when they were enslaved and imported. But for the first 100 years of the United States being, there was zero federal immigration policies on the books. And what happened? I mean, we became, as you were saying in the book, the most prosperous, the most free for some country in the world at that point. And so like, okay, so that kind of seemed to work out for some for a while. And then you look at other examples throughout the world where immigration policy is liberalized. And I use that not in the political sense, but just like the sense of opening up more freedoms of movement. And the fact, the effect on both the receiving country and the people who are actually doing the moving was overwhelmingly positive. And it was like, huh. And so you just like start to piece together all these different pieces and say like, well, what we need here is a clear argument. And then one of the other major things I try to do with this book is just to clarify the situation on the border right now and sort of where that came from and give the historical and economic context about why the border is where it is and why it works the way it does. And I think that was also, I think a lot of people have found sorely lacking. It's become a way to just completely paint your enemies in the worst light. You mention the border and something that is going wrong there, or something that is happening there, and automatically it's just used as like a campaign attack ad. And there's no real conversation happening about it right now. And that's extraordinarily frustrating, especially when you're on the board and you see when you see the reality with your own eyes and see the way that it's painted in national or just larger media outlets and by politicians. So I just try to bring some clarity to the issue and just point to another possible solution.
All right. Well, before I turn it over to Richard, I couldn't help but smile when you were talking about you coming from the left, because I grew up as a liberal Democrat, and when I went back to practice law in Laredo, I had the mindset that government should be helping the poor, and so forth. And this was before I discovered libertarianism. But I remember I went to the federal judge and asked him to appoint me to represent illegal immigrants for free, because I wanted to challenge the whole constitutionality of this system. And I was walking around the detention center and watching all these guys just milling around, like a couple hundred guys or so. And it just hit me. It was like this light bulb goes off saying, my gosh, if the liberals love the poor, needy, and disadvantaged as much as we say we do, how can you treat people like this? I mean, it was just, I couldn't believe it. So I went and talked to a couple of my liberal friends and I said, how do you reconcile this? And they said, well, the law's the law. And I said, well, yeah, but the law's not necessarily a good thing sometimes. And that's when I realized that the left suffers with a lot of hypocrisy on this issue, because to treat the
Oh, yeah.
poor in this way is unbelievable. Like you mentioned, concertina wire under the water that is designed to cut people up, to serve
Yeah.
as a deterrent. How do you live with yourself when you favor this kind of thing? Richard?
Yeah.
Okay, I assume that there are some people who watch our webcast who do not fully agree with the kind of views that we articulate or that you are doing in this book. So I'm going to play devil's advocate because I want to hear your response and try to make a case. Okay, fair enough? Okay,
Please.
there recently was published a few years ago a book called The Death of Europe by Douglas Murray. He's a British conservative, fairly market-oriented in various domestic issues, but he has made the case in this book that the openness of immigration in the European countries, particularly from peoples from the Middle East, the Muslim countries, is undermining and destroying the culture of Europe. It is totally upending the cultures, the traditions, the language, the notions of respect for law and human relationships because of the closedness of many of the more extreme Muslim practitioners. And that therefore to allow this wave of immigration is to, in fact, ignore the fact that the people of Europe, though there are differences in countries, share a certain commonality of a worldview that has gone on for 1,000 years. And they seem to be the only people who have no right to have an indigenous protection from colonizers from the outside.
Yeah. Well, I have a couple of quick reactions. I haven't read the book. I'm familiar with it. I think I've glanced at it a couple of times, but I haven't read it, so I can't speak to his some of his specific claims. But I have done a lot of research about rule of law and how it is affected by immigration. And overwhelmingly in the United States, in Europe, in Germany, which saw a lot of people scared and complaining about changes to lawfulness or lawful behavior after, especially 2015, 2016, they saw a lot of migrants. And the number of crimes have not gone up in any of the largest receiving immigrant communities. So, just looking at the statistics, I think that in terms of how folks are received and how folks are resettled, crimes don't go up. There are some exceptions to that. And of course, the obvious exception is that in any group of people anywhere in the world, there are folks who are going to cause harm. And there's actually no evidence that those numbers go up in immigration communities or in people who are recently resettled through refugee policies. So there are outstanding examples, and people can make a lot of hay with those. And I think that's a shame to paint too broadly and smear an entire community. Um, you know, I haven't been to Europe since the pandemic, but my family's Romanian, and I've traveled there a bunch, and I studied in Europe for a little bit. And after the opening up of immigration controls in the beginning of the European Union, and I don't think anyone is thinks that France isn't very French anymore, or Spain isn't very Spanish. Um, Cultures change no matter what, and they're always in flux, especially given the rise of technologies and the rise of access to different cultures, throughout the world. And that goes both directions. That's not just in immigrants coming, but about people having access and understanding about different parts of the world, going and traveling and, bringing back cuisines and different modes of thinking or literatures or whatever. So, to try to lock down a culture to a certain point is a fool's errand, I think, and has actually led to some of the worst policies and even atrocities that we've seen in the past century or so. Is when people try to essentialize some moment of Americanness, and here we saw it with "Make America Great Again," that slogan, or Germanness, which we see again with the rise of the AfD in Germany, or we saw, I mean, in the worst atrocity in human history with the rise of National Socialism in Germany in the 30s and 40s. So that, I think, is one of my first responses. And then another one is, well, yeah, I understand maybe that some people are a little bit on edge, and there is change, and whenever change happens, people, get a little anxious about it. I think that's understandable. But the tables have turned in terms of immigration overall. So if you look at the number of Europeans, Germans, Italians, Dutch, Poles, I could name a number of other nationalities who left Europe from the 19th century to the, early to middle 20th century. We're talking 50 plus million people, maybe more. I'd have to look at the exact numbers and do the timeline, but it was immigration. Sorry, European was an outward exporting place for centuries, and that didn't seem to bother anyone until the tables turned, and now people are coming into Europe at a rate much lower than what was happening 100 or so years ago, and people are all of a sudden upset about it. And that seems to me just kind of fundamentally unjust. And another thing, just about a term that you used, and I think you're probably quoting or paraphrasing Murray here, but the term of colonizers. So I think that doesn't apply. That just does not apply to the folks who are coming to Europe right now. There will be a transition period, but we have seen in recent history that people do assimilate. There are pockets, there are enclaves where the culture is more pronounced. We see this with Little Italy in New York, and different places in Boston with the Irish, and we can point to places in Texas with like that are more Mexican or speak more Spanish. But overall, people really do generally assimilate, and there's no evidence to show that that won't happen with this current wave of migrants into Europe. So colonizers, they are not, and you just look at more carefully at the definition of that term, and that would apply to a lot of people who are leaving Europe in the earlier centuries, not so much the Germans and Poles and whatnot in the 19th and 20th. But I just think we just need to be careful about how we use that term. Like in calling people now invaders or something, or colonizers who are coming across the US-Mexico border, just doesn't make any sense. It just doesn't apply to them.
Well, I use that rhetoric because it's a rhetoric that is often used by the left about certain people, such as the Israelis, they're the colonizers, and so on. As if their movement there in past decades or over the last century or so is somehow an infringement on the indigenous people and the culture of that time, and therefore they have an unnaturalness to be there. Mm-hmm. It's just I hear people like Douglas Murray say, well, if that's how you're going to view it, well, why is it that the only indigenous people not allowed to preserve their culture, their language, their history are Europeans?
Yeah, I mean, they are. We obviously are. No one's threatening the French or the Germans from losing Germanness or Frenchness or their language.
You see why I'm doing that,
right? And I think like I think probably we could get hugely distracted by the Israeli-Palestinian conflict right now, but I think that there is just a very marked difference there in the fact that when Israelis were moving to, or when what became Israelis were moving to that land, there was a huge forced displacement of people, and there's no displacement of people currently in the banlieues of Paris or the outskirts of Berlin and Munich and things like that. That just there's no displacement happening. So I think colonizers could apply to the people who moved to Israel in the the middle of last century, but just doesn't here in this case.
All right, John, you talked a lot about the positive impact in your book of immigrants, especially on America. Would you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so there's actually a recent study that came out just a week or so ago about the fiscal impact of ongoing migration in the United States. And the number was that over the next 10 years, if migration rates stay where they are now, there'll be an extra $1 trillion in US federal coffers, which is money I think we could use. There's a lot we could do with it. I worry about what we do with it because, the current military budget of the United States, annual military budget of the United States is almost $1 trillion, which is insane. Yeah, there are again, and study after study after study, and you look at it from a micro level to a mid level to a macro level, you see that actually communities, states, and even entire countries always benefit from migration. At least the way that the current system is set up. Within that broad umbrella of benefit, I think there's also some problems there, that there's an exploitation of migrants. This is where we're pushing people to work into the black market, and we're able to pay them less or give them less worker protections. And I think that's a shame. And it does help local economies. There's also another recent study that showed that there's about 500,000 job vacancies in the construction industry. Who's going to fill those jobs? We're just not training or directing enough native-born Americans into construction work right now. So those jobs are most likely going to be filled by migrants, and without them, it would be rough. So basically the way that it works, I mean, this is something that, leaning on economists, which I am not, is the once you kind of break out of this mindset of a fixed number of jobs in any economy, I think it really starts to make a lot more sense. And that's the lump of labor fallacies where, oh, a migrant's going to come and take my job. Well, actually, even if a migrant comes and takes a job, what will happen is that person is going to maybe resettle with their family. They're going to need to send their kids to schools. They're going to buy food. They're going to buy all sorts of things in a house, and all these things that require more workers, and that actually inject more money into the local economy. So, they break it down with these very complicated equations, and they're able to, get the exact statistics, but they show over and over again that more people into an economy, more working people into an economy, actually is a benefit. And there's a number of counter arguments that usually quickly arise here. It's like, well, they're also going to use our welfare more. They're going to send their kids to school. They're going to be overcrowding the schools. They're going to use medical benefits and all this. And again, we see that actually overall over a lifetime, there's some variation in this, but mostly migrants actually pay in more to the welfare pot than they take. And though some resources are used more on the first generation, by the second and third generation, migrants overwhelmingly put more money into local economies than they take out. And you look at one of the biggest examples that I focused on in the book was in 1980 in Miami, when in just a few short months there was 120-some thousand Cubans that came to Miami, and it took a lot of work to resettle them and to help them kind of orient. A lot of that was done by community, not by the government, but it all worked out, and it worked out very quickly. There was like one tiny sliver of the local economy that maybe saw some adverse effects in like year one, but overall, over like total number of jobs, wages, and any other metric you look at, it was actually good for Miami, and that is interesting, given that I love throwing some digs at the left right now because I think that their immigration politics have just been abominable. But supposedly this Democratic mayor out of New York City has been, just uproarious in his reaction to 160, I think it's maybe 170,000 migrants to New York City right now, the most diverse city in the world, the city built by immigrants. And we look at what happened to Miami in 1980, and it was fine. You're telling me that 170,000 people can't figure out how to, settle in New York City? Are you kidding me? And one of the things I looked at there was just like a couple of other moments in New York City's history where there's a lot of migrants, and the percentage of newcomers over the past 2 years is far below some of the percentage we saw in the early 20th century, in the late 19th. And just like, city was fine. Are you kidding me? Like, come on, you can't reset 170,000 people in a city of 8-some million. So I think it's a joke.
Richard?
Yeah, I'm continuing with my devil's advocate business.
Please, all of it.
Okay, so and the following argument is one that you hear in some variation on both, quote, the left and the right. Surely the very notion of a country having a sovereign identity is the ability to determine who will be allowed to enter the country and have access to welfare programs or to vote, because voting can influence the political direction of a country. And therefore, if you don't have borders, you do not have a country. And if you don't have a country, then what's the whole meaning of a political structure that has a certain set of rules and orders and constitutional procedures? So then you're saying is that every other country can have these borders and say, we don't want these people, but America is just to be an open area in which the world can just flood in and no rules.
A couple things here. So a couple points of clarification first. One is I'm not only advocating for opening borders in the United States. I think it has to be a global position, and opening borders anywhere I think is a positive step, but it would be not even a half step. It would be a quarter or an eighth step or whatever. Second is there's a distinction to be made between open borders and no borders. I'm not advocating
open borders
and no borders.
Okay.
It's interesting. There are some people who advocate for no borders. I don't see that as something being either feasible or achievable right now or anytime soon. So, one of the things people who really think hard about open borders suggest is that actually it will help all the things that you just mentioned. Because right now, and this is a complaint that you hear thrown about quite a lot, is we don't know who's coming into our country. And we don't know who's coming to our country because we try to not let them in our country, and they're going to come in anyway, so they have to come in through the back door or the side door or whatever, and they have to sneak in somehow. So we don't know who those people are. If we let people in and we registered them and we processed them, we would know who they were. I think also, and I've actually written about the idea of extending the franchise to non-citizens in the United States. We have permanent residents, we have people who have been living in communities for a long time and don't have any say in the government that wields a lot of power over them. And I don't think that's fair. And I think that those people should have access to the ballot. But I also think that it makes sense to wait a little bit to make sure that they're actually going to stay, to make sure that they invest in the community. I mean, both financially and, more broadly, spiritually, and just as people and as residents. So I think that there's ways to work out those details, and I think it's maybe not as daunting or complex as we think. It's like we let people in. Once they're registered, then they pay into the system. Currently, right now, and I think that this isn't a terrible model, you can't receive any welfare benefits, any of the or like means-based welfare benefits, with some exceptions, but almost more broadly, you don't get SNAP, food stamps, things like that, unless you're at least a legal permanent resident. You can't receive Social Security until you're a citizen and you pay in for at least 5 years. Um, and there's all these different ways to just sort of make sure that it makes sense for people once they're here, they're registered, we know who they are, we know that they're paying into the pot in all these different ways. We know that they've, lived here for a little bit and kind of understand the system and the civics of things so they can actually vote in a meaningful way. Um, I think that it would, those arguments for me, I think address some of those issues, but there's still like this kind of gut reactionary thing. It's like, but we would be overrun or they would take all of our stuff. One, I think other important thing to mention about the first argument is that we would be overrun is that we have lots of examples as well of that not happening. Um, there's been these polls taken about how many people would migrate if they could or would migrate to the United States. And it's a lot of people, but those people are going to be limited in their ability because it costs money to migrate. And we also know that most people migrate close to home. So when they leave their home, overwhelmingly, they stay within their international borders. If you look at the total number of migrants throughout the world, if you consider anyone who just moved, they don't leave their country. Then if you look at international migrants, those who cross an international border, they almost always go to a neighboring country. Here's one interesting stat that I think would maybe calm some of the nerves of the Murray guy, is 90% of current African refugees are in Africa. They've just moved to a different country in Africa. You look at the Venezuelans fleeing all sorts of problems, many US imposed in Venezuela. Overwhelmingly, they are in Colombia and Peru and some Ecuador. Now there's maybe approaching 1 million in the United States, but people don't go far usually. And another example is like Puerto Rico. Puerto Ricans are US citizens. They could all leave the island if they wanted to. The difference in GDP from Puerto Rico to different places in the United States is incredibly imbalanced. They've been hit by just devastating hurricanes, and the island hasn't emptied out. People want to stay where they are. So a key part also of opening borders is making sure that people can stay in their homes. The right to stay is I think, a necessary corollary to opening borders.
All right. John, you talked a lot about the wall down there on the border. And one of the fascinating things that you pointed out was that the wall or the barrier in the border is of a recent phenomenon. And would you talk a little bit about the deaths that wall has produced, not only in terms of just the wall itself, but how you talked in the book about how it was diverting people into very, very dangerous areas. And then another aspect, which I found absolutely fascinating, was the wildlife aspect of this in your book. And I was really struck by your story of that lone wolf that came down to the wall. And so obviously it doesn't compare to the human travesty, but would you talk about both the human travesty as well as the wildlife travesty?
Yeah, let me start with the wolf because I picked up a new bit of reporting on this. I'm working on a story about jaguars. There's a couple jaguars in the United States right now, and this is their original habitat. This is where they actually first evolved in the southwestern United States, and they since have moved and proliferated in Mexico, Central and South America. But they're an important piece of the ecosystem here, and I've been looking into how they're starting to move and make a little bit of a comeback, especially in Arizona. And I was talking to a wildlife biologist just the other week, and he told me about a wolf reintroduction project that he had been working on for years. And the day that Donald Trump took office, which was January 2021, I think, of what was that, 2017, um, a they tracked one of the wolves that they introduced into northern Chihuahua, the bordering state of New Mexico and Texas, and it crossed the border on the day of Trump took office, wandered around in southern New Mexico for 4 days, and then crossed back. Exactly where that wolf crossed, there's now a wall. It extends like 30 miles in one direction, and I don't remember, a few dozen miles in the other direction. That wolf is not going to be able to make that journey, and that's actually incredibly important for genetic diversity, for the health of those both populations on either side of the border. They need that access, and if they don't have it, they're probably not going to survive. There are some corridors now along the U.S.-Mexico border that are not walled off. There's a few in Arizona. There's not many, but there are a few in Arizona. And they're not walled off because it was very expensive and hard to reach. And the Trump administration, even as they were trying as hard as they could to close it off, it was just they didn't get there. If those are closed off, jaguars will very likely never be able to really reestablish in the United States, nor will the wolf populations, a number of other animals as well. And those are sort of like the marquee animals, and they're amazing to look at and exciting. But it matters because it really does change the health of an entire ecosystem on which we also depend, humans. So that's sort of one of the main wildlife arguments. There's a lot more about biology and environment in the book, but yeah. So about the diversionary
Wait, before you go there though, you told that story in your book about that lone wolf that came down and encountered the wall. Would you
Yeah.
tell us about that? That really moved me.
Yeah, that was also one of the reintroduced wolves. So the wolves got reintroduced on both sides of the border, in two different populations. And this was a wolf that got reintroduced into southern New Mexico. There was a number of different reintroduction moments, but I can't remember. This one was in the 20 teens, I believe. And it came down in 2019, I believe, and it was going south. And these male wolves need to roam, and that they look for their mates, and they're just, they can't stay where they are because they'll get, like every these wolves, like a couple of the males leave the pack and they roam, and that's just like the way it works. And it hit the wall, and it wandered back and forth. They were able to track it with a collar. It wandered back and forth along the wall for a week or so, couldn't find an opening, and went back. And I think they eventually lost track of it. Yeah, it's really sad story, and it's like we put a lot of like invested a lot into trying to rebuild these ecosystems, but there's very seriously under threat by wall construction. Yeah, so as for the diversionary strategy of the wall, that is not something that, I or other, researchers or scholars sort of extrapolated from what we were able to see, but it was actually written into policy in 1994. It was called Prevention Through Deterrence. And the idea was that if they built walls and put more border guards along major crossing routes, which were then relatively easy between El Paso and Juarez, between Nogales, the sister cities on, Sonora and Arizona borders, or San Diego and Tijuana, that people would have to take to the desert, or they'd have to go through the Rio Grande, and it would be really hard, and they would suffer, and they would die, and that message would get out, and other people would decide not to do it. So the problem is that it didn't work. People did suffer, people did die, but ultimately they kept on moving. And then they extended it, they doubled down, they extended those walls, they surged more, border guards to the border, and that didn't work either. And we've been playing this game since the 1990s of really trying to build up the wall and really trying to seal off different parts of the border, but it's the balloon effect. You clamp down on one part of the border and people go elsewhere. And to try to effectively, completely seal off the border or maintain operational control, as DHS says, of 2,000 miles, incredibly diverse terrain, you know, it's even that I think is impossible. Even the DMZ gets crossed and people find ways out of North Korea. You can try, you can spend billions or trillions in trying to block off the movement of people, but I think that even that won't work. And this kind of gets me into more of the idea of how much deterrence has failed. And there's a couple elements that I look at here. One is, in my first book, which is a lot about the history of asylum, and I followed a bunch of asylum seekers. I'd spent a lot of time reporting about family separation because as I was reporting it, I was spending a lot of time in Central America. It was in 2018, and it was right when the family separation crisis hit. And what is amazing is that both in sheer numbers, in the months immediately after the beginning of family separation policy, more families were crossing the US-Mexico border. They didn't see like the most inhumane immigration policy that we have in recent years as enough evidence to not try, because what was pushing them was so compelling, it was so urgent that they needed to move, and they did. And one of the, I talked to a lot of families who were in that situation. One of the main guys I profiled in the book, Arnobis, he traveled with his 5-year-old daughter. They got separated for a couple months. I mean, this is probably lifelong trauma that was imposed on both of them. And when he was eventually deported, what did he do? He picked up and went again because he was going to die where he was deported to. And so the motivations and the human will to move when it's necessary is not going to be blocked by a border wall. And then, you could point to a number of different examples throughout the world of trying to clamp down and how much it's failed. So we spend all this money, we and other countries throughout the world spend all this money. We, impose this surveillance regime along the border. In many places where I live right now, there's internal checkpoints that are 30, 40 miles away from the border. There's cameras on trails I like to go hiking on. There's blimps in the air. There's unmanned predators, aircraft flying over the border zone, and all of it doesn't even work. Like, what are we getting out of this?
Richard?
Yeah, I'll be interested from your perspective is that when people have read your book, or maybe you've spoken before groups, or even in individual conversations, and you've laid out your case, what do you find the hardest nuts to crack in terms of the attitudes and arguments on the other side?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it goes back to one of the earlier topics we were discussing about, and that then Murray profited, this idea about identity. I think people are scared, and I think that fear is easily wielded in a political context. And I think politicians, I could name a couple of them in particular, but it really extends on both sides of the aisle, really use immigration to stoke fear. And I think that people have lost some of the other institutions that have sort of given them identity over the last number of decades. Maybe demise of institutional religions. This idea of like the internet globalizing us in a different way, of us being online all the time and not like really making these more close to home connections. I think we're losing exactly what we're anchored to. And so what politicians and the anti-immigrant folks will do is lean into ideas of nativism. And like this is where your identity is. It's a national identity. That is what gives your life meaning. That is what ties you to a place. And that's strong. And I think it's especially strong because what I was saying at first, because I think other ways of feeling tied and feeling like woven into the social fabric have actually been fraying over the last number of decades. So people really just react to this idea of like, here's a scapegoat, migrants, the open border. And it's really easy to point to that, and it's very effective. And it's hard to break people out of that and be like, actually, we don't have to worry about that. I live, as I mentioned, I live in Tucson. We get a lot of migrants passing through here. Most of them don't stay. They go to places where there are opportunities. Why wouldn't they stay? We are a Democrat-led city and in currently a Democrat state. We're so-called sanctuary city. We would be welcoming, but there's just not that many jobs and opportunities here. So they go where they are, and they find their place and they find their work, and they sort of spread out. And if they were staying, and well, whatever. I was about to paint the counter argument a little bit, but I think my reaction is that, like, actually point to me an example of something going wrong with migration. Like, what actually is the problem here? And again, there are outlines. There's like, these so-called angel families where whatever, like the migrants have committed harms, of course, but everyone commits harms, or every population has people commit harms. But really, what's the problem? And I think that people can't point to it. They kind of then fall into abstractions and talk about, well, no, they're taking this and taking that, but are they? Because they're not, and like they actually don't have evidence for that because it's just not true.
We're about out of time.
I think it's more tribal in that, and it's the same thing that was experienced in earlier waves of immigration to the U.S. in the 19th century, when it basically was practically open. The uncomfortableness with the stranger, the alien. The Irish came, the Poles came, the Germans came, and if you read the history, those who had preceded them, who were viewed themselves as, by golly, Native Americans, not in the way we talk about Native Americans, but they'd been born here. They felt uncomfortable. They don't have our religion. They don't speak our language. Their cultural behavior patterns are such that they make me uncomfortable. They seem to be disrupting the way things operate, and that is for a lot of people a difficult thing to overcome. Now, in the 19th century, since there were no immigration laws to speak of, these waves of people could come, and you might not like the person who's coming, but since there was no political means of restraining it, restricting it, prohibiting it, you just sort of had to learn to live with it. Now, there were conflicts and violent acts, but in general, you just had to live with it.
Yeah.
Now, when there are these degrees of uncomfortableness, the state has become the means by which you can try to prevent the stranger from arriving to make you feel uncomfortable.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think, yeah, I was trying to sort of say the same thing, but tribalism is what it comes down to, is the use of this, like, sort of almost maybe inherent sort of reaction we have to, like, protect your own or something. And I don't blame people for having that reaction, but I think that the target shouldn't be migrants, because they're actually not a threat to identities.
We're about out of time, but I want to emphasize something that you emphasize that is so important, and that's the police state aspects of this. I mean, you talked about the highway checkpoints. I mean, they were there in Laredo. You head north on IH-35 and you go over a crest of a hill, and there's this immigration station where they can subject you to a full-scale search, open your trunk, show you your papers. And the darker-skinned Hispanics, and Laredo was about 98% Hispanic when I was there, Mexican-American, they were the ones that get stopped. The Anglos would be waved through. And yet it was just a surreal sight, because you felt like you were in Mexico coming up to the border. And then they've got warrantless searches of ranches and farms within 100 miles. They would come into our farm. We had a farm on the Rio Grande that I grew up on, and they would come in without a warrant, and they would bust our workers. We hired illegal immigrants. They were the hardest working people I've ever seen. And this becomes normalized over time, and roving border patrol checkpoints where they would just stop anybody. When I was in high school, a guy just turns on his light and pulls me over and says, "Open your trunk," for no reason, not even a broken tail light or anything. And this police state becomes normalized, but it really is a police state.
Yeah, so again in Arizona too, in like 14 years ago, we passed a law here, SB 1070, which was like the first state try to more or less usurp a federal immigration authority. And this case went up to the Supreme Court, and eventually they more or less allow racial profiling in for immigration enforcement. Border Patrol is allowed to use basic techniques of racial profiling, like someone is not speaking English or they look like a migrant, to use that as justification for pulling them over or for stopping and asking them questions. Um, and that now happens every day here and elsewhere. Yeah, and currently the checkpoints as of a couple months ago are actually have all closed down. This is supposedly in reaction to like this surge of migrants, like of people turning in themselves in and asking for asylum. And it's been nice. I've never driven some of these highways without having to stop. And all of a sudden, I just like, wow, just like drive on through and not have to deal with this. And like, I have nothing to worry about, mostly. I've been pulled over into secondary a couple times. I've been harassed by Border Patrol plenty of times, but I'm a white guy with a US passport. And so like, I kind of have nothing to worry about. And even for me, it's just like, thank God I don't have to deal with this right now.
Yeah, and the other thing that I remember about your book was how you showed how Black migrants and Hispanic migrants are treated much worse
Oh yeah.
than the white migrants.
Yeah, I mean, in so many different ways. I mean, like I said, you look at like the racial profiling of stopping people, but I've done some reporting on like we just have the statistics to show that Black migrants are held in solitary confinement overwhelmingly more than migrants who are lighter skinned in immigration detention. In solitary confinement, like why are we putting people in solitary confinement for crossing a border? This like over 15 days is officially constitutes torture according to, UN definitions. People are held in solitary confinement in immigration detention for as much as 30 days. Um, they're also deported at a higher percentage compared to their population of other migrants, people from Somalia and Haiti, and they get lower they get lower grant rates for asylum. So we just like have the numbers be like, well, we're clearly just discriminating. The system is discriminating against people who are darker skinned and in really awful ways. I mean, especially about that solitary confinement.
Okay, the book is The Case for Open Borders by John Washington. I cannot recommend it too highly. As we've been saying for 30 years, open borders is the only solution, and this book has the potential of really shifting the paradigm in America to really the future, the only real solution to this 80-year-long plus immigration morass. John, it's just been a real honor and a pleasure. Thank you very much for taking the time to visit with us and give us the case here on this show for the Case for Open Borders. You can buy the book almost anywhere. If you like it, recommend it, because this book truly has the potential of shifting America in a much freer, better, more prosperous, harmonious direction. Richard, it was great to see you again, and I look forward to seeing you. And John, thank you again.
Yes,
Thanks to you
let
both,
me share
guys.
that. Thank you for
Yeah,
joining us today. Greatly appreciated that you gave us your time.
thank you so much. I great work y'all are doing, and yeah, thanks again.